Hey guys, Zimzola99, and by the time you're watching this, it will be, of course, September 4th, with fall essentially around the corner. A decrease in video frequency sadly will happen, but I thought I'd make a nice, well-structured tail end to the quote-unquote summer uploads. So without further ado, here is my review of King Terenos by TerenosAdvent. Originally mentioned in my Trodontus review, he is now getting his own video, of course. To begin, let's go over the design. It is a large bipedal reptilian, of course, many the subject of my videos, but like I state in my Trodontus review, Terenos' overall proportions are far more realistic and in keeping with his origins. The product of a late 40s nuclear experiment, looking at the effects of living tissue when exposed to radiation, it appeared that reptiles were the most resilient to these tests. However, the subjects would be abandoned as a hydrogen bomb would be dropped on the facilities, leaving the test subjects to undergo a wholly new experiment, and Terenos would appear to be the result of such bombings. What I think is a nice touch is that the creator has shown a full classification for Terenos, and we see that Terenos' origins are that of a Ramastic lizard. Looking at these little guys, you can see that much of their general anatomy is mirrored in Terenos, however, of course, exposed to radiation and all that. But this represents how to design a mutated creature, and it actually somewhat resembles what they are mutated from, as the details of an Ramastic, such as the spines on their legs, their super spiny tails, and their just general head structure, are all mirrored in Terenos, but of course on a large and mutated level. Looking at height, Terenos stands 109.5 meters tall and 250.3 meters in length. So he's around Heisei monster height and length, and generally that's around the size most people's kaiju are in the community. But Terenos is not the biggest kaiju as well. That's always something I stress, is that if you're gonna make your main monster, don't make him the biggest and always the baddest unless it's important to the story. As you can see him here next to this multi-limbed mutated turtle that towers over him. And to speak more about this other kaiju, Mr. Collins, who is the creator behind Terenos, he's made a lot of other characters in kaiju, and they are just really stunning. They draw on a lot of real-world anatomy, and all these kaiju right here, they all have a real-world analog, and they just are all shown to have little bits of mutations to them, but you can still see what kind of creature they all come from if you can spot what kind of reptile they are. I should also note that in Terenos' profile, he has a thing called a mutation order, and its class is classed as a major and in parentheses Olympi Grand, so I recommend further elaboration be put into that so we can understand what the mutations overall are, because I'd assume that is important to the story, as genetic mutation and tampering are important to his backstory. Now let's move on to powers, and we'll start off with Terenos' signature Gamma Breath ability. It is a green stream of radiation. It is, however, used only as a last resort. It's similar to that of a flamethrower, but when coupled with another ability, the Gamma Breath becomes what is known as the Mega Breath. The breath is no longer a weapon of last resort, and due to the excess radiation the second ability causes, the breath is used almost constantly, and it turns into a more condensed beam of sorts. So a way to imagine it would be like Shin Godzilla's breath, how it goes from a fire to a condensed purple laser beam of sorts. But the upside to the coupling of the abilities in the Mega Breath is that the overload of radiation is expelled through the Mega Breath, so this allows a counterbalance for Terenos. But the second ability that causes the Mega Breath to occur is what's known as Gamma Rage. Gamma Rage is described as a self-defense mechanism, and it gives him a dramatic increase in power. He's able to send foes flying with physical strikes and his Mega Breath, but due to the realistic nature of this universe, the ability causes an enormous tax on the body, leaving Terenos fatigued after its usage. The ability is similar to my own Kaiju Zogra's Judgment Dragon, or for anime examples, Goku's Kaioken, or for the example I'm showing on screen, Oma Tokida's advance from the fighting manga Kengan Ashura. But like in any anime, Terenos has an ability that allows him to
go even further beyond!
Gamma Wrath is a further pushing of Terenos' limits. Now completely warped in the gamma radiation he uses, Terenos is a danger to things not just standing in his vicinity fighting him, but just the general area as a whole, and his Gamma Breath, no longer just a beam from his mouth, is now an all-consuming wave that comes out of his body. But Once this state is exhausted, he is extremely vulnerable, but his body does have a safety net in the form of his scales hardening to defend him from minor injuries. However, due to them only hardening to sustain minor injuries, if he were to be hurt in a major way, there could be some trouble, so Terenos only uses this ability under extreme circumstances. The only issue I take with the abilities is the name of one of them, and that is the Enhanced Gamma Breath Mega Breath. Personally, Mega Breath sounds like a downgrade in terms of names. I think Gamma Breath just sounds better, and I think terms like Ultra, Mega, Super are far too common in attack names, and I think that it's also stated that Gamma Wrath specifically, that Terenos' power becomes on par with the sun, so maybe sun or close to sun names or solar names like Nova Beam or Soul Beam could work, but if we don't need to be sun themed in its naming, maybe Radiance Beam, Gamma Cannon, and stuff like that. However, I also noticed that there's no ability name for the full body gamma radiation wave that comes out of Terenos while he's in his Gamma Wrath state, so I do suggest Gamma Wave just to keep up with the whole gamma naming structure. But again, that is only a suggestion, and you can take that for what you will. Now that I've done an overview of the character and his appearance, I want to give a critique on the story and the establishment motif of the world, and that is realism. And the biggest critique I can have for the design overhaul is, how do you justify it in your world and setting? The design is a perfect kaiju in and of itself, but with the context of this being a mutation, you need to implicitly justify how this mutation can benefit your kaiju, rather than just having fluff that is divorced from any kind of logic in your universe. There is many times where I can say that people say, oh, this kaiju is a mutation. It may look not really too mutated. It may look like a perfectly new animal, and the mutation is just a backdrop to the character and its appearance. Certain franchises can get away with it, but if you are really wanting to focus in on realism and trying to make a realistic world but not have a super deformed creature as your mutation, then there should be at least a few justifications. Like the mutations that created Terenos, of course, were on a biological level, and instead of them just being pure mutations, they develop into an adaptation, because mutations are not just like random, although when exposed to radiation that tends to be the case in popular culture and just our understanding of radiation. Mutations usually occur in nature to respond to specific events, so you could justify it as maybe because humans are making more megastructures like skyscrapers, cities, all of that. Animals are able to grow to larger sizes due to this, or specifically we know that in the story reptiles are able to withstand radiation better, and they seem to be mutating in ways in which they're developing large grasping front arms, they're becoming bipedal. There should be ways in which you can justify it implicitly, like the characters do not necessarily have to know specifically why the creatures are mutated in this way, but through your story and your writing, you should explore that, because I do think that realism in a kaiju setting is something that can be a good thing, but it does not necessarily have to be something where your kaiju are downplayed because of it, because I wouldn't say necessarily the idea of Gamma Wrath is a realistic power, but it is something that appeals to kaiju fans, and I think a lot of kaiju fans would like to see that. The reason I did bring this up specifically is because I saw this picture here. This wasn't one of the pictures that Mr. Collins actually asked me to use for the review, but I noticed that and its similarity to Terenos' Gamma Breath and Mega Breath, so I assume that probably all of these monsters are developing similar powers as well as similar appearances and mutations, so that's what primarily influenced this specific critique. Also, I think talking about realism, the idea of niches is important, and I think building a kaiju niche, as it were, is something you can do, and there's a few things you can do to build this niche. To start out with, what does being a kaiju do for this character? Like, what being a kaiju is compared to the creature they mutated from? This means stuff like, how does their diet change? Is Terenos now completely carnivorous compared to the Ermastics, which are generally herbivorous, although they do eat insects from time to time? So is that amplified? Are humans now on the menu because of how large he is, or is he killing other kaiju because there are now creatures of his size that he can hunt? behavior. Does Terenos sleep a lot, or is he always looking for food? Is he a wondrous animal that is walking around cities and just kind of destroying stuff, or is he more stationary and wants to be by itself? Temperance is also something to keep in mind, although you have started on this as Terenos post-mutation is far more aggressive than the small lizard that he originated from. And I would also say that finally, territorial range I think is important, because animals do indeed have a certain range about them. They do not go outside these ranges generally unless under specific circumstances like a pressure or being affected by humans, although that is also a pressure in and of itself. So these are all things I think are important, especially if you want to make a world that is realistic and specifically for you. But I think generally these next points are more important to just anyone who wants to make a kaiju universe in general. And those are like, now that you have a kaiju, you need to think of these things. And the first I would say is social impact or societal impact. How does your kaiju affect the world around it? And does like the average person have a certain opinion of the monsters, or are their origins known to everyone? And how does that change relations with certain people and groups and stuff like that? And human danger, of course, is very important. Is your kaiju a direct threat to humans because he sees them as a food source, or are they just naturally being affected because these monsters are rampaging through cities, but they're not directly trying to kill people? And that's going to be coupled with property damage, like he's going to be destroying buildings, or are they just moving in certain ways that scientists would be able to understand that no, he's not trying to destroy things, they're just in his way. Now we need to understand what is he looking for, and economic impact is going to be important. How is the world economy going to deal with a giant monster? This is something that's explored a little bit in Shin Godzilla and more realistic worlds. I know Henry the host, it came from Monster Movie Podcast, the Apex universe, goes over this a little bit in detail. And another thing that universe goes over is religious implication, because kaiju naturally are not hard sci-fi. They do break the conventions of normal science to a degree, so you need to come up with an explanation in terms of, like, of course, how the science behind your kaiju works, but also, what does this mean for the everyday person? Is there a culture shock, a religious kind of awakening for people? How do they see this? And finally, a government response. What does your kaiju's actions mean in terms of what will the government do? Will they send in the military, or is your kaiju friendly and the military fights alongside them to deal with bigger threats? All these are things you should take into account, and I think they're some of the most important things you'll need to look at if you're looking at a more realistic kaiju universe. And if you're going to be working on a comic or a book, this allows you to have a wide range of topics to cover in issues or chapters, and it can extend your series out for a long time, and you'll always have a lot of content for your viewers to consume. But these are just all my opinions. Just generally, Terenos is a well-designed kaiju. I just think that right now the story needs more work in terms of justifying his appearance in the world. And if you can expand on that, I think you'll have a perfect basis to take your character in some interesting and realistic ways that I know a lot of people want in their kaiju stories. But that's all, guys. Hope you all enjoyed, and without further ado, I am Zemzilla, and I will see you guys next time.